I'm going to try to avoid using that microphone because I always feel like the voice of God when I talk into one of those things. So I'll try to be loud enough for everybody. It's a great honor to have the benefactor who makes this lecture possible here with us. Thanks very much for being here. It's wonderful. Yeah, I was going to mention that I actually did learn things from reading Tom's dissertation, which concerned the relationship, roughly speaking, between arguments and stories in the thought of Thomas Aquinas. And I have found in my experience as a teacher that arguments without stories are empty, and that stories without arguments are blind. So that in my own work with my students, and for that matter, with myself, I try always to have both the arguments and the stories. I feel I've learned an awful lot about how to do this from reading Plato. Plato has been the hub of the wheel for me intellectually, truthfully, ever since I was a freshman in college, when my roommates bought me collected Plato because I was always talking about him. And I was at the University of Chicago at that time. I later transferred and graduated from Notre Dame. But I went 2 weeks without going to any of my classes because I read all the dialogues. And that's when I started to actually get an education. So I suggest that strategy to those of you in the honors college. So I'm going to be drawing on some material from the book that Tom mentioned, Plato's Bedroom, Ancient Wisdom and Modern Love. I would have just called it Ancient Wisdom and Modern Love, but that sounds like a large German treatise. And I thought Plato's Bedroom at least sounded like somewhere you might want to go. My idea is that by reading Plato, along with especially Shakespeare, our own lives become richer and more interesting to us. I think one of the great things philosophy can do when it combines arguments and stories is to put us in a position to appreciate ourselves, our own lives, to make us more interesting. It gives us something to live up to when we see what we can be. And that's a point I want to come back to. I think it's a hallmark of being a Platonist, which is what I am, to think that what something most really is what it is at its best. If you want to know what you are, find out what you are at your best. Not what you are when you're tired, not what you are when you're seeking comfort, but what you are when you're accepting invitations to aspire to something. That's how you know what you really are. And Plato's account of love is shot through with the notion that love is the most powerful engine we have for leading us to aspire, to become what we truly are by becoming better people. That's a question I'll return to at the end of my reflections today. I don't want to start at the happiest or the highest things about love. And when I talk about love, I'm talking about what we would typically call romantic love, what the Greeks, being more shameless than us, or perhaps more honest, would have simply called eros, erotic love. Love that has the special charge that sexual attraction brings into our lives. We live in an incredibly impoverished erotic world. The Greek word for sex doesn't exist. They didn't have a word that is well translated by our word sex because they never did anything that boring in Plato's bedroom. The Greek name for the human act that can bring a new life into the world came from the name of the goddess of beauty, Aphrodite. It was simply called the things of Aphrodite, the aphrodisia. And Eros, as the name of that whole realm of human experience, where we fall in love and we try to stay in love, Eros is the name of a god. The name of love is a god. What are the names of love in our world? Sex and sexual intercourse? The word sexual intercourse, the phrase, was first used in 1792. The act is considerably older. The phrase comes from a famous work a foundational work of public health, Thomas Malthus' Essay on Population. Malthus famously argued that the rate of natural increase of human beings would exceed the increase of the food supply so that we would all starve and be subject to famine. Sexual intercourse starts in that cheery place. Not a bedroom, but a boardroom. Malthus used the phrase sexual intercourse as a euphemism for the kind of social intercourse, the kind of interactions between men and women that would cause that scary natural increase. That's where the word comes from. It comes from a certain ideology of public health. So that the most common polite phrase in our world for the things the Greeks gave the names of gods to are things that come from a completely medicalized, controlling language. It doesn't even sound like something you'd want to do. Would you like to have sexual intercourse this afternoon? I think I'm going grocery shopping. Or maybe I got to go to the dentist, because that's another kind of medical thing, right? We start at such a deficit of experience. One of the great philosophers of the 20th century was a more or less crazy Austrian named Ludwig Wittgenstein. And one of the wonderful things that Wittgenstein said was, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. What is your erotic world? And if you don't want to live there, what do you have to do to your language? Now, you might say, well, look, it's true that if I were in a seminar, I'd probably say sexual intercourse if I had to say anything at all. But if I were just talking, I'd probably call that making love. Now, sexual intercourse entered the language in 1792. Making love has been around, the phrase. You can find it in Jane Austen, for example, between a man and a woman standing in full view of a dinner party as they stand off to the side and engage in the kind of conversation that people who are falling in love with each other engage in. Making love originally referred to the kind of conversation and focused attention that finding somebody else erotically attractive draws from us. And you can still find it used that way in English literature down into about World War II. It's only much more recently that the phrase making love has come to have this very narrow physical meaning. It sounds a bit more emotional than sexual intercourse, but what started as the name for a very large phenomenon of human life has become narrowed down into hardly more than a physiological exercise. We live in a bad place erotically. If you could find a way to have a world that fits a language of gods, of something sacred in the human sexual power, we would all be a lot better people. Well, I wouldn't be much better because I already live like that. I just read Greek. Now, some of you are lucky enough to be able to do that, but most of you are going to have to take control of the language world you live in right now and decide what you want to say about falling in love and being in love when it has that special energy of sexual attraction. By the way, the word sex, that seems like that word must have always been around. Yeah, since about 1880. The word sex to refer to the difference between male and female is very old. The word sex to refer to what we call sexual activity, that came into being in the late 1800s as part of a medicalized discourse of the public regulation of people's sexual lives. That's where it comes from. If you'd like your sexual life to be managed, I suggest you keep using that language. If you want a different world where you experience ecstasy, exhilaration, aspiration in your loves, I suggest you look for another language. I'm not sure what it is, but I mean, you're young and strong. Think of ways to describe what your heart desires that doesn't reduce you to some sort of plumbing function. So, we live in a debased and deranged erotic world. The limits of our language is, I think, gives us the limits of our world. So what are these beautiful names of love that I claim the ancients had? Why can't we just use those? Well, think about Aphrodite's name. A beautiful name, no doubt. What is an aphrodisiac? It's a drug. It's a medicalized thing. It's more like a poison than it is like a potion. The very name of the goddess that the Greeks used, we have destroyed. We have made into a mere drug. But, and here the classics department is crucial, fortunately, there wasn't just one ancient language. Because if Greek is broken, we can turn to Latin. So we can use the beautiful name that Latin uses for Aphrodite, Venus. And we can talk about the venereal. Right? That's just the adjective version of Venus's name. So I am going into business. I'm hoping to get some of Tom's money. I want to make Valentine's cards that say, "My love, let us turn to our venereal pleasures." Now, if you read old enough poetry, you could actually find the word venereal used that way. The market for our cards, Tom, will be a little limited. Only the most antiquarian or ironic lovers are likely to buy them. The only way that the word venereal exists in English now is venereal disease. Live there if you must, but escape if you can. The names of love indeed. A sacred thing that opens human beings to the divine more potently than any other single human experience, that we have debased in order to control it, to put ourselves under the control of the public health authorities, to learn how to have safe sex. Who the hell would want to have safe sex? No Greek would ever have had that. He fell into the grasp of a god. That's not safe. It's not nice. It's not tame. Reminds me of C.S. Lewis. Right? The Pevensie children in the Chronicles of Narnia. When they ask the beaver, the talking beaver, fortunately he's named Mr. Beaver, so it's easy to remember, right? They ask him about the Christ figure, the lion Aslan, and they're a little worried about meeting a lion. I mean, wouldn't you be? And they say, well, is he tame? Is he safe? And the beaver says, tame? No, he's good, but he's not tame. Well, that's what sex is. At least, that's what the beautiful things of Aphrodite are. To put yourself in a position to open up to a new identity in love with another person is not tame, it's not nice, it's not susceptible to a management science or the public health authorities, it's not like pouring chlorine in the sewer. It's a choice, and you have to embrace the choice of change, of losing an identity you have now in order to take on a new identity. Let me say something about that new identity. When Plato thinks about erotic experience, the first thing that he notices in his great dialogue, the Symposium, I guess we're having a symposium. It's not nearly as good as the Greek ones, because they reclined on couches and passed around a big bowl of wine they drank from. Symposium just means drinking together. In his dialogue, the Symposium, Plato emphasizes that the men, and they're all men at the Symposium, they all want to be kind of macho. They all want to show they're manly. They don't want to be soft. They don't want to be too musical or poetic, because their culture codes softness and musicalness and all those things as kind of feminine, and therefore in a man effeminate. So they didn't want to be like that. What did they want to be like? They wanted to be all about arguments. They wanted to be rational. They wanted to be philosophers, understood in a certain way. As if the best way to be a philosopher was to completely exclude from your life the kind of ecstasies, transports that erotic love seems to subject us to. So Plato gives us this really very funny picture of a bunch of men who are claiming we're so rational that tonight at our symposium we're hardly going to drink at all. Now, it turns out the reason they're not going to drink at all is they were all drunk the night before. They all have hangovers. They're not devoted to rationality. Their sobriety is a rationalization. It's not rational. The reason that they're not giving themselves over to ecstasy is that they're too weak for it. But who says, I'm too weak to fall in love? It's much better to say, I'm too smart to fall in love. Smart, weak, about the same thing. And so Plato's putting his finger on a false identity that philosophy lets people slip on like a bad suit. The identity that says falling in love is the end of reason, rather than the goal of reason. After they get done saying, and we're not going to drink tonight because we're too smart, then the next thing they do is say, and by the way, the usual flute girl who comes and plays for entertainment at the symposium, don't let her come in either. I don't know, send her to the other part of the house. She can play to the women if she wants. She is an emblem of Aphrodite. These men are going to give speeches about erotic love, starting out by getting rid of anything that's too intoxicating and anything that's too feminine. This is not a successful strategy. And Plato shows the failure of that strategy. That's part of the movement of the symposium. This is part of what makes it such a great work of literature. The key word here is the word androgyny, that combines the Greek root andro, a man's man, with the word for a woman, the gynos root. Androgyny is an aspiration Plato cares very deeply about. The notion that in the fully developed human person, there will be some aspects that most cultures, certainly Plato's culture, coded as specifically masculine, and other features that that culture codes as specifically feminine. And that real philosophy, real reason, as opposed to mere rationalization, has to combine those apparently male and those apparently female features into one personality and one form of human life. So that androgyny becomes the name of a kind of aspiration. Plato knows that in a way this is shocking. But so much is at stake for him in undermining certain macho views of what philosophy is, because it distorts and limits philosophy. That kind of machismo, that kind of overly masculine, tough guy view of what the life of the mind must really be, that's a language world that Plato didn't want philosophy to have to inhabit. So he tries to break through it and open it up. So Plato gradually brings the flute girl back throughout the dialogue. I'll leave out the details except to say that in the great final speech by the drunken Alcibiades, whom if you don't love, you're really not even alive, he actually brings a flute girl with him to get the party going again. All right, so Plato enacts the retrieval of Aphrodite as a culmination of what philosophy can be. Now, probably the most famous speech in the symposium is actually not the speech of Socrates. It's probably the speech of the comic poet Aristophanes. Because Aristophanes tells a wonderful story. Not an argument in sight, but it's a great story. And I can't give you the whole story. You really should go read it. But it's a picture of human beings in their original form, not being like we are now, but instead being big globes. And we had tremendous power and self-sufficiency, and we didn't need anybody else. We didn't have any erotic longings for anybody else. We didn't fall in love. But we were so prideful in our power and self-sufficiency that Zeus had to cut us down the middle and make us two broken halves so that we wouldn't be too powerful and too prideful. Now, once we're cut down the middle, our body parts have to be rearranged. And that's the story that Aristophanes tells. Where does sex enter human life? Where does eros enter human life? It enters in our attempt to go from wounded halves back into being a whole. And so the physical expression of sexual intercourse then gets a very deep psychological interpretation. We're broken halves that try to return to wholeness through establishing a relationship with another human being whom we love, who is, as the movie says, my other half. Now, I don't know if the guy who wrote Jerry Maguire had read the symposium, but he inherited it. It's where the image comes from. Part of what's so striking about this is Aristophanes sees androgyny not so much as just what we can accomplish as individuals, but rather something that's most fully accomplished in couples. We live an androgynous life, from Aristophanes' point of view, when we get back together into that perfect round wholeness, where one half is male and one half is female. But notice the language. One half is male, one half is female. Not that one individual is male and the other individual is female. From Aristophanes' point of view, the most real thing is a human couple, not a human individual. Human individuals, from an erotic point of view, have to be understood sort of like a severed limb, as something broken. To understand them in their wholeness, we have to look at couples. Now, Plato gives that speech to Aristophanes, and Aristophanes isn't the last word in the symposium, but he is a very important word. Because now we see not only that some integration of the male and female within an individual's personality is important, but the integration of the male and the female in a human couple becomes the paradigm for what the best human life would be. Because the couple is more real than the individuals, more original than the individuals. Plato develops this in a number of different ways. But one of the things that should be obvious, but talk about the limits of my language or the limits of my world, oddly enough is not obvious to us anymore and hasn't been obvious for about 55 years. Which is to say that when men and women have sex together, they make babies. We live in a contraceptive era. There's never been one before. We're hardly 50 years in, a half a century, that's no time at all, to the most extraordinary experiment in the history of human beings. However long they've been here. 100,000 years? There's never been anything like it. We live in an acid bath of an erotic world in which our fertility is perceived by us as an illness. So that the smart money, the public health money, old Tom Malthus's money, is on telling every woman. Notice how they put it on women. You would think that the virgin birth was not as unique as it was, right? You'd think women just suddenly got pregnant. You wouldn't know couples got pregnant. The contraceptive mentality doesn't make couples first. And so it dumps a bunch of chlorine on women. So under this spell of contraception as the regular state of anybody who's not white trash, which is the way the public health authorities work, how did they get people to stop smoking? Just by telling them you'd get cancer? What the hell, everybody dies. But who wants to stink? Right? Who wants to look like they're not educated? So instead of smoking making you look sophisticated, which is what it used to do, now smoking makes you look like you're unsophisticated. That's how public health authorities work to get you to change your behavior. And so they've had a huge amount of success in getting both men and women to change their behavior by somehow all believing not in one virgin birth, but in a whole bunch of them. It's like, man, what a bunch of accidents are out there. But what if, when it comes to our erotic lives, it's as a couple that we're a real thing? All of a sudden, things look quite a bit different. All of a sudden, the human power of procreativity looks absolutely central to our erotic lives. Think of our erotic language. Think of how little procreativity is in it. For example, it's very hard to find a movie, a romance movie, a love story, in which at the heart of a couple's erotic attraction for each other is that they see each other as potential parents. Now, real human beings, that is a normal part of falling in love. Takes some people to the point of getting married before they start to notice that about each other. But it's a very real human power. The power of procreativity isn't an illness. It's a tremendous blessing. If you're dishonest or impatient, it's probably something you're a little afraid of. Actually, even if you've been married 10 years and you're having another child, it might be something you're a little afraid of. I mean, babies don't look scary, but when you get near them, they can be pretty frightening. But to embrace the power of procreativity is natural. That's the natural human condition. What in the hell are we doing? Where do we live? How do we talk? How do we think? How can there be movies in which men and women are coupling like crazy and it never occurs to anybody they might have a child? The suppression from our minds of this power that we have is an extraordinary accomplishment, but it's also an evil accomplishment. And it's something that we need to resist. I'm not saying you all have to go exercise your power of procreativity this evening, but when you meet somebody and you feel that spark of, I'm falling in love, one of the things you're falling in love with is your procreative power. But of course, when it comes to procreative power, you're a broken half. When you say your procreative power, the reference of your is the couple, not the individual. One of the, I mentioned movies. It's very hard to find a movie where our procreative power is a central part of what a couple loves about each other. It loves about being a couple. The best example that I have found is from the Lord of the Rings movies, of all places. Those of you who've seen the movies, you'll remember there's a subplot about an elf princess, Arwen, and her love for a mortal man, played by Viggo Mortensen. His name's Aragorn. Elves, by nature, do not die. They can be killed, but they do not die. They're immortal. For Arwen to marry to this mortal man means not only that she takes the marriage vow for better or for worse till death, it's much bigger than that, because she doesn't have to die at all. For her, the marriage vow is what brings death. She has to accept death in order to marry Aragorn. And there's a wonderful scene in the second of the movies, The Two Towers, when her father, Elrond, the elf king, confronts her about this and tells her, you can leave and enjoy an immortal life in the Undying Lands, which is something elves can do. You can leave this mortal world and still be immortal. If you stay with Aragorn, even if he's completely successful in the war, becoming the king, all that stuff, he will die. And Elrond gives her an incredible vision of what it will be like when Aragorn dies. And we see the tears stream down her face. And she leaves. She leaves to abandon Aragorn and to go to the Undying Lands. In the last movie, The Return of the King, the movie with 8 endings, that one, we see Arwen going to the Undying Lands with some other elves. And she has her own vision that now competes with her father's. She has a vision of Aragorn and a little boy who she realizes is her potential son. And she rides back home and tells her father, I'm staying with Aragorn. Because she replaces a vision of her own individual immortality with a vision of her participation in, so to speak, a mortal immortality through her power of procreativity. Now, how did that scene get in the movies? It was because, not Peter Jackson, but the 2 women writers, Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens, didn't think that they had a strong enough motive for Arwen to stay. And when they thought about what the motive could be, they thought about her having a child with Aragorn. Now, it's wrong to think that what happens here is that, well, she doesn't love Aragorn enough to stay in the world and die, but she would love her child enough. No, that's not it at all. It's that she realizes her love for Aragorn includes the fact that together they can have a child. Part of her union with Aragorn exactly is the fact that together they're a procreative couple. So that is an extraordinarily countercultural moment in the Lord of the Rings movies. Very unlike the standard narratives that we find of love and romance. Let me point to one more thing about erotic love that I feel like I learned from Plato and from Shakespeare. And this is the problem about vision and illusion. I don't know if any of you ever had this experience with one of your friends or a roommate or something, where your friend or roommate takes up a new relationship or seems to be pursuing one. And the thought goes through your mind, sometimes it pops out of your lips, and that goes really wrong. What does she see in him? That is a really good question. What does she see in him? Does she see something more real? Does he see something more real in seeing what's best in that person that nobody else who's not in love with you sees? Not your mother, not your father, not your brother, not your pastor, not even your professor. When somebody falls in love with you, you become an icon of God for them. They see something in you that's divine and that's real. You'll remember there's an old book that at one point mentions that God created human beings in his image and likeness. And then, rather surprisingly, says he created the male and female. The image and likeness of God comes to us through androgyny, through the male and the female. But the beginning of the Bible, that's the old book, is all about God as a creator. And so the primary way in which human beings are an image of God is as procreators. That's why they're male and female. Now, it's not procreation all by itself, because right away we get the story of Adam and Eve. And what Adam says when he sees Eve before him, and people who know Hebrew tell me that he can't even be grammatical, which seems exactly right first time he sees a naked woman who's his wife. Adam says, "Flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone." Probably the most erotic thing anybody ever said. That's all about union between the two people. It's not about procreation. But after all, just 2 pages earlier, we had the notion that the image of the divine in the other person comes through our participation in procreative power. And if you don't trust me, there was another really good teacher who put both of those things together, those two passages. His name was Jesus. That was in Matthew 19, and you should look it up. So, union ultimately opens into procreativity. Union isn't about an enclosed couple. Union is about an open life that includes an openness to your own procreative powers. So it seems to me Plato understood things. Now, he also thought there was spiritual procreativity, as do I. But you might say the paradigm case for Plato, as it is for the Bible, is the case of the procreative male-female couple. That's the standard by which we judge erotic love. The problem is that seeing that person as divine when you fall in love with them can be reduced to an illusion. Right? We say that, well, when you're in love, you see through rose-colored glasses, or even worse, love is blind. The greatest treatment of this theme known to me is in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. And toward the end of A Midsummer Night's Dream, there's a great competition between two speeches. One is the speech of the king, of Theseus. He's the public health authority, who gives a famous speech about how poets are of imagination all compact. They're nothing but lies and imagination. It's all illusion. They make it all up, and lovers are just the same way. What does she see in him? She's making it up. He's a fiction. But the other guy, the guy who's obviously the hero of A Midsummer Night's Dream, is Nick Bottom. He's the lower class guy. He's not the king. And Nick Bottom gives a speech. He's been translated, transfigured into an ass, right? He has an ass's head on. It's incredibly funny. You'd think it'd be sort of terrifying. He loves it. And when he finally gets it off, he gives a speech where he reflects on it, and he actually cites one of Paul's letters to the Corinthians about how the eye has not seen, the ear has not heard, but he gets the sensory modalities mixed up, which is synesthesia is an image of transcendence, so there's a bunch of stuff going on there. I won't go into that now. Your teachers will fill in the blanks on that. What he says is, I have had a most rare vision. Is it an illusion or is it a vision? I think when you look at the man or woman you fall in love with and see in them something divine, I think that's a vision. And I think it's the erotic power that we have that lets us see that in another person more potently than any other kind of love. I think your lover loves you with a more potent love even than your father and your mother and your brother. Certainly than your professors. So, A Midsummer Night's Dream looks to me like it's interpreting an idea that's in Plato's Phaedrus. I won't go into that idea here except to say that Plato, too, experiments with the idea that when the lover sees the beloved becomes an icon of the divine. It's through seeing what's divine in the beloved that the lover works. Now, you might wonder, do I even want a lover like that? Do I want to be loved in a way that a Platonist loves me? Always seeing me for what could be best? Doesn't that sound tiring? Do you want to have to live up to the idealizing image that your lover has of you? Or would you prefer a comfort zone? A comfortable lover who, as they say, loves me just the way I am. Well, from a Platonic point of view, just the way you am isn't what you really is. Many young men have had this experience. I know I did back when I used to be young, when I first met Tom. He used to be young then, too. You become an actual man by trying to live up to the image that the woman who loves you has of you. That is the single most powerful force for male maturation that I have ever seen. I think it happens with women too, but I have more first personal experience in the other direction. And I'm telling you, I'm hoping that my daughters have that power too, so that the young men who fall in love with them try to live up to the image that my daughters will have of them. As I say, I think it works the other way too, but if this is a witness talk, I only witnessed it from the one direction. Right? My wife always seemed really good to me. maybe she got better because she tried to live up to my image of her. But after all, I'm a Platonist. I saw her for what she really was all along. So, you can decide. You can make your erotic world any language world you want. And you can have the kind of smart alecky, cynical reductions of love that say it's all illusion. Or you can have the visions of love that Nick Bottom had. A most rare vision indeed. I want to end with one last comment, or maybe it's two. First, a comment to the faculty. I've been reflecting based on my own experience with Plato's Symposium and with Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream particularly. I think if your students graduate from Baylor without having read those two works, you should give their tuition back. And I have one last thing to say to the students. I think if you haven't reread those books before you're 30, you should give your diploma back. Thank you. Tell me where we are in time, Tom. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, we have some time for question and answer for Professor Fox.
So, I mean, this is a beautiful talk. I've been glad to agree with everything you say. But I don't think that you can find the idea of a connection between eros and either marriage worship anywhere in the ancient world. Ancient love poetry, not only is it not directed toward someone who is or could be your spouse, but people who are of that stratum of the society are just simply excluded from any kind of erotic discourse, let's say. When you look at Plato and Socrates and all those guys, I mean, not only were either they were not married or they had the first terrible marriage, like Socrates couldn't reconcile them this beautiful vision of Aristophanes and Symposium with the complete absence of the real purpose of erotic love, which you so beautifully explained.
I'll have to say things more briefly and dogmatically than I'd like to be able to on this. So part of the issue is that in the ancient Greek context that Plato's writing his way into, both the literary context but the social context, relationships between a man and his spouse were not typically expected to be erotic. In fact, there's a wonderful passage, is it in Herodotus? I'm forgetting where it is now, where it's noted that a man had the misfortune of falling in love with his wife, and then he does these stupid things, right? Now, typically, the social gap, the age gap between the man and the woman was much greater than it is in contemporary society, so there's a lot of things to say about that. But I think there was a lot of erotic feeling between husbands and wives, and I think that it depends which text you look at. Particularly, there's a text that's really a treatise on how to run your household by a guy named Xenophon that has a long section on basically how to educate your wife, which we might not like very much, but after all, you're talking about wives who were in their early or, well, mid to late teens and men who were in their mid-30s. So the notion that you had to take some responsibility for educating your wife doesn't seem so crazy under those conditions. And one of the things being managed there definitely is erotic feeling between them. So I think that it's present there, but that doesn't undermine your more general point that it wasn't paradigmatic, generally speaking. I think part of what happens in Plato's Symposium is Plato gets to his place his culture did not get to, because he is focused more on the androgyny problem, the integration of things that are masculine and things that are feminine, because he thinks philosophy can only break through from certain cultural bounds of a fake masculinity if it's more androgynous. So his mind goes there. But when his mind goes there, not being under the spell of contraception, his mind also goes to pregnancy. And so, extraordinarily enough, when Socrates gives his own speech, he says, I learned everything I know about love from a woman, which within the context of that dialogue is really striking. And the images that that woman, Diotima is her name, gives of erotic life are all procreative. It's true that she ranks procreating children lower than spiritual forms of procreation. It's a very curious moment where I think we see one of Plato's limitations. I think that Plato wants to make an argument for philosophy between two men being the best kind of erotic relationship, but yet the standard he uses to measure the male relationships is actually the procreativity of the androgynous relationships. So that it's like he's apologizing too much, because he makes a big deal about how a philosophical relationship between two men, again, an older man and a younger man, so it's asymmetrical, will be procreative, spiritually procreative, rather than physically procreative. So Plato's a very interesting resource for us in seeing how, by following out a certain logic, a certain critique of the one-sidedness of masculinity, he is driven to a position that I don't think he would really want to embrace. But sometimes a good story goes farther than you wanted your argument to go. And that's the way I read the Symposium. So that would be the direction I would go. But I think that's a really worthwhile thing to have a conversation about. Yeah.
Thanks for a very wonderful talk. You mentioned quite a bit the gods Aphrodite and Eros, but there's a god related to the discussion of the Symposium which is named explicitly as Dionysus. The phenomenon that you described as falling in love, would you describe it as a kind of reintroduction of the god of Dionysus also, a kind of tropiness, as opposed to the sort of cool, collective ratiocination of having no wine at all, or was it something in between?
Yeah. Now, if you'd like me to give another lecture, I can actually, I can do it all on Dionysus. Yes, the short answer is yes, the Symposium is built around the initial exclusion of two gods, Dionysus and Aphrodite, the wine and the flute girl. And it culminates with the re-entrance of both. The flute girl with Alcibiades, and Alcibiades himself dressed up in the emblems of Dionysus. A fuller picture of Plato's idea of our experience of the erotic would show that it's too good for just one god. He needs both of those gods, both Dionysus and Aphrodite, to say everything he wants to say about it. So I think as a reading of the Symposium, what I've done is quite partial by just focusing on the Aphrodite stuff today. And that the Dionysic stuff is hugely important and it goes all through the dialogue. As a matter of fact, in what scholars tend to say about the Symposium, they much more often notice the Dionysian stuff than they do the aphrodisiac stuff. So that I suppose part of what's most distinctive about what I'm doing is to emphasize the centrality of androgyny and the integration of the feminine, and therefore of Aphrodite, the resurrection of Aphrodite, compared to interpretations that pay more attention to the question about the Dionysian. But,
Let me take one more.
yep, one more. And then I'll start the second lecture. You got to decide which one, since you're He's cutting the rest of you off.
Corey, go ahead.
Tom, pay up.
Basically the real human is a human couple, right? So does that mean that any man and any woman could potentially form a couple, or is there a specific man paired with a specific woman?
Yeah, that's a big deal. If we don't go bankrupt on the venereal Valentine's Day cards, I got another set. It comes from Aristophanes' speech, because when the original round complete humans are split, they seek their other half. But if their other half dies, they go seek another one of the right type. Is erotic desire more structured by unique individuals who complete us, or by people who fit a type who will complete us? When we're in the first person mode of falling in love or being in love, we're unique individual interpreters. Right? I don't want to hear how much she looks like her sister. Right? And so there are lots of competitors in that part of the Valentine's Day market. You're the one. You're the only one for me. Keep repeating the word one enough times and it sounds incredibly romantic. But now go to a third person point of view. You don't have to name any names, but think about this. Have you noticed any erotic patterns in your friends and roommates? Do they have types? Do they have tendencies? I had a colleague who dated 7 Jennifers in a row. Huh? Or your friend comes to you brokenhearted because the unique other half has gone on to greener pastures. And I say, well, you can say it. There are a lot of fish in the sea. I had a student who, when we were talking about these things once, she said, when I went to college, my grandma only gave me one piece of advice. She said, it's as easy to fall in love with a rich boy as a poor one. Now, you need not take this as personal advice, but I think there are a lot of men and women you could marry well. A lot of them are in this room right now. But I think history plays an important role in making somebody the one. And then certainly the history you live out with somebody makes them more and more unique in your life. So, I mean, after 30 years of being married to my wife, she's obviously a pretty unique part of my life. So history enters into this in a complex way. It's not just the uniqueness model or the type model. Both those things are there in the structure of our erotic desires. My Valentine's Day cards, though, since there are plenty of the You're the One cards, are going to be You're one of the ones. But since Baylor is now being led in the STEM direction, we will also have cards that say, you are a member of my maximal erotic set. And what's really great is you can buy them in bulk on discount. So this tension between whether it's the individual that is the primary object of erotic interest or whether it's a type that individual only represents or embodies, it's a very deep Platonic question. So thanks for asking it.